Thank you. Can you see my slides then?
Yes.
That's great. Okay, I'm gonna, wonderful. Okay, so hi, everybody. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to kind of give you a taste of my research in the past 6 years, which attempted to link language evolution and change to language acquisition to language diversity, and you'll kind of maybe see that there's all these loops going around with this. So the beginning of the talk is more kind of stuff that I've done over the last 6 years, and I really hope we get a chance to look at to get to the final slide, so we'll see how much time we actually have, because I also have some future projects that I'm happy to present to you, so things that are gonna start very, very soon. Okay, so to me, I always start with this slide already for many years now, because I think that one of the most interesting questions in the field of linguistics and cognitive science is, why are there so many different languages in the world? So what could be the possible sources for this astonishing diversity? Because there's really a lot of diversity, 7,000 different languages. And if language is a tool for communication, then you might expect, it will be very useful for all of us to speak very similar languages. That's clearly not the case. So what's going on? And I'm also interested, related to this question, in asking, how do different languages evolve? So what are the cognitive and communicative pressures that shape this kind of language evolution in our species, and maybe also in others, as I kind of hinted out. And finally, I'm also interested in, do languages differ from each other in their learning trajectories? So how well they are learned, and what kind of mechanisms enable language acquisition across childhood and across modalities. So in my research so far, I've been trying to kind of like shed light on these different questions using experimental methods mostly, but also recently computational methods, and I'm going to showcase some of this work today. So I think the first thing to consider when talking about languages is that languages are constantly changing. So if there is literally one universal pattern we know to be 100% true for all the languages in the world, is that if people use them to communicate with each other, these languages will change over time. And it's a very powerful universal that we somehow tend to overlook, but I think it's super important to kind of look at this process. And we can think of language evolution or language change as the process in which linguistic innovations or variants emerge and then spread. And in the case of the cultural evolution of language, the story is pretty straightforward, is that, well, people, they innovate all the time. They randomly or intentionally produce new sound variants, they create new words, they use new grammatical constructions, but only some of these variants are then going to be adopted by others and spread to the entire community. And this process is generally termed cultural evolution, and it's somewhat analogous to biological evolution in the sense that there are mutations that are spreading, both as a factor of natural selection, some may be better than others, but also as a factor of random changes. And how does this process actually occur in language is what I'm interested in. So how do linguistic innovations emerge and then spread? And how fast can they become the new linguistic norm? So to answer these questions, I'm currently using agent-based computational modeling. In these models, you look at different populations of simulated agents that have carefully controlled capacities, and each of them use different variants. Here it's marked with a color. And then I examine how these different variants tend to spread in the population over time until most agents are using the same variant, and you can say that a norm is established. And I think most importantly, these models allow us to examine how this process of conventionalization is affected by the agent's cognitive capacities and their communication patterns. And this is done by manipulating things like how flexible or stubborn these agents are, so how likely they are to adopt to other people's variants. Or do they have a preference for some variants over others, what is sometimes called a content bias? How many variants can they store in their memory at the same time? And also, who do they tend to copy from? And these types of computer models can provide really valuable insights because they break down this very complex process of language change into small and very transparent steps that we can examine. So just to give you an example of some simulations I've done with Bill Thompson and Will Schiller, we looked at agents' personalities, so how likely they are to adapt or accommodate to others. So we looked at the proportion of flexible versus stubborn agents and asked if that would affect this convergence. And the results of different simulations, actually in this case, I think are pretty clear, pretty simple. They show that this doesn't have such a big impact on language change. Even if there's a lot of stubborn agents, so a lot of people who are very much, sticking to their own variants and their own language, this only slows down the spread of variants to the entire community, but it really doesn't stop it. So as long as agents are not 100% stubborn and can accommodate a little bit, very rarely, then the network will eventually converge on new variants. And this would probably explain why indeed languages keep on changing, even when people are, quite conservative. If they even have a tiny chance of copying, that's it, that's enough. And I'm going to get back to some more computational modeling work later in this talk, but now I'd actually like to shift the focus and talk about the experimental work I've done, because that's the bulk of my research. So I think a first important question to ask is, how do people actually learn these variants of their language? And looking at language acquisition, one of the biggest questions in the study of human language is, how do children even discover the structure of their language? And more generally, how do children learn these repeating patterns and regularities in their environment? And one possible answer that's been proposed is that children have statistical learning abilities. So that's the ability to implicitly detect patterns in sensory input based on distributional and statistical properties like transitional probabilities, co-occurrences, and so on. And the first behavioral study I ever done, I did this as a very junior master's student, was to look at this crucial mechanism and to ask two questions. The first was, are statistical learning abilities stable across child development, or do they change with time? Do they become better or worse, or just the same at learning these regularities? And the second question was, are these learning outcomes kind of different across sensory modalities? So does statistical learning develop differently in the visual and auditory domain? So to answer these two questions, I conducted this large-scale study of statistical learning across modalities and across development. We tested 230 children between the age of 5 to 12 on kind of matching visual and auditory segmentation tasks, and we looked at their learning accuracy. You can't see, but that's me on the side. Okay, so when we look at this, at the results, and here what I'm plotting is the age on the x-axis and the accuracy of learning in the y-axis. What we found here is that there was a difference in the developmental trajectory of statistical learning across modalities, such that although statistical learning improved with age in the visual modality, it was age invariant in the auditory modality. So auditory learning did not change much during childhood. And these results showed that statistical learning develops differently across domains and suggest that it is not a unitary and stable capacity, but rather modality sensitive. And I do want to mention that since this study, there's been other extension replications, and now I think the result is more fine-grained. So it's not just that visual learning improves, is that it depends on the prior knowledge that we have. So one of the reasons that auditory learning doesn't seem to improve over age is because we already have so much knowledge about, core occurrences of syllables. And if you use different non-linguistic auditory stimuli, then you get a result that looks a lot like the visual modality. So just to mention this as kind of a more updated result. Okay, so next I want to study language evolution in the lab, and specifically the emergence of linguistic structure in the process of cultural transmission. And I did this using iterated learning experiments, where I'm pretty sure most of you have heard about this before. In these experiments, you have participants learn some target behavior, like an artificial language, and then their learning output, so they learn something and then they get tested, and their output in the test is given as inputs to the next person. So the next person learns what the other person produced, and so on for these kind of chain of generations of participants. It's a bit like a broken telephone game where you see what happens at the end. And previous work by Simon Kirby and colleagues at Edinburgh showed that this process can lead to the creation of systematic linguistic structure over time. So compositionality, basically grammar. And this is really cool because it effectively shifts the explanatory burden for the origin of grammar from having this biologically evolved innate capacity to just a cultural process that shapes linguistic patterns based on our individual cognitive biases. But when I saw these studies again as late in my master's, I was like, but what about children? Because one important criticism of these types of studies is that all the participants in these experiments are adults who already speak a language. And the problem with this is, well, older participants, first of all, they're not the typical language learners in the real world. And second, they may benefit from better working memory, more sophisticated problem-solving strategies, and they could just rely on their previous extensive and somehow explicit linguistic experience and knowledge of grammar. And if this is true, then the findings from these iterated learning studies are not so interesting because they're not evidence for the underlying process that's responsible for the evolution of language, but rather just the result of, already having a language and already mastering a language. So I thought it was really crucial to test this paradigm with children who are indeed the main language learners in the real world, and they have much less explicit knowledge of the grammar of their language. So to do this, to test the role of child learners in the evolution of language, we designed this child-friendly iterated learning experiment and compared 140 children to the performance of 100 adults in 2 different conditions, basically mimicking the original study by Simon Kirby, and I'm trying to replicate that with kids. And the results are pretty interesting. You can see the time on the x-axis, the generation number, and basically the structure, how much grammar emerged in the language on the y-axis, and this black line is chance. So, well, not chance, but everything above this line is considered grammatical structure. And when we compared this, what we found, first of all, is that adults consistently create compositional languages. They also significantly outperform children overall, which is not surprising. And when children's languages, although they didn't show this increase in compositionality, as you can see, the kind of blue line stays below this black line. But still, we found that there were some instances, if you can see the spikes, there were some instances where children's languages did become, they did develop languages with significant systematic structure on multiple occasions. It just didn't survive to the next generation. And children's languages also became easier to learn in both conditions in exactly the same manner as adults. So we found some parallels. But when we went to analyze these results even further, we saw that the differences between children and adults in this paradigm were related to how well they managed to learn their input language. So basically linking these findings back to language acquisition. In general, we found is that participants, both children and adults, who learned the languages better were also more likely to introduce structure to their inputs, strengthening this kind of relationship between your learning biases and language evolution. So if you didn't learn the language at all, you weren't able to add any systematicity or regularity. But once you kind of managed to learn it a bit, you were also able to kind of amplify the patterns that you saw in this. And this result has also been replicated already with adults in a kind of more designated study that looked exactly at this relationship. Okay. So next, I want to examine the process of language evolution in a more realistic setting, because, of course, in the real world, people don't just learn and transmit languages from generation to generation in isolation, right? We don't do this. We actually interact with other people in the course of our lives, and we're subjected to communicative pressure when interacting. So it's not the case that you learn the language as a child and then never change your language anymore. That's not the way we work. We interact and constantly have this communicative need. And I wanted to test how languages can evolve in a community from scratch due to interaction. So how does grammatical structure emerge? So to do this, I developed kind of this group communication paradigm for testing how grammatical structure emerges and then spreads in a miniature community. So what I did was to bring participants to the lab and to ask them over the course of several hours, it was a pretty long experiment, to create a new artificial language to communicate with each other. And people in the same group interact with each other in basically about different types of novel scenes. I'll show you how this looks like in a moment. It was just different shapes moving on the screen in different directions. And they earned points when they successfully understood each other. And they were not allowed to use Dutch or English or any other language they knew. They couldn't point or gesture. They just really needed to come up with kind of nonsense gibberish words to describe these scenes. I'm going to show you how a typical interaction between two people in the group looks like, so you get an idea. So here's what it looks like. One participant, the producer, sees a shape moving on the screen in a given direction. And now they need to provide a label for it. So let's say the person calls this wape. If this word is legal, that means it's not in Dutch or in English or in any other language we know, that our participants know. We pass it to the partner, the guesser. The guesser sees this word wape along with a grid of 8 different items. One of them is the right item, and they need to select what they think their partner meant. And I just want to reassure you that I think this looks pretty epileptic. Like, this is really hard to follow at the first second, but the participants have 4 hours with this, and already after like 5 to 10 minutes of doing this game, they get pretty used to it, and you kind of learn to recognize the shapes that are here. So don't be alarmed. It gets more familiar. But then once they click, okay, I think wape is this shape, they get feedback. So they get to see what was the right item that their partner selected, and what their partner selected if they were wrong, and then learn from it. And then these 2 participants switch roles. So basically, the person who became who was the producer now guesses, and they kind of alternate between being a guesser and a producer multiple times. And after they do this for about 20 minutes, they get up and they switch partners. So they go to talk to somebody else in the group. Okay, and importantly, I have to say at the beginning of this experiment, people are just guessing. They have no idea what's going on. They're making up the words randomly. They're typing out different stuff, and it's just a trial and error. But over the course of several hours, and especially once you have a successful interaction with someone, you kind of can anchor on that. And then you actually start developing linguistic structure and regularities over time. So essentially what's happening in these groups is that the participants are creating a grammar where different part words or morphemes are used for describing the shape, and other part words or morphemes are used to describe the motion, so how it moves on the screen. And throughout the experiment, I look at these emerging languages and I look at several measures. The first thing I look at is whether people successfully understand each other. So is it the case that they actually get the points, they get it right? And that's true. The second thing I look at is whether the group ends up converging on a shared language, because you can also imagine that every participant has their own kind of variations, and the other people just learn them and understand them rather than everybody kind of adopting one uniform language. So I look at this convergence. I look at how much do these languages change over time. So how much do people change the variants that they're using over the course of the game? And lastly, how systematic and compositional these grammars are. So like in this kind of illustration I'm showing you, this is a really systematic language. It has a really clear grammatical structure, but of course languages can differ in how well and how systematic they end up becoming. And this paradigm allowed me to look at how languages evolve in real time in a community, and to show that really a simple communication between people can already lead to the creation of systematic grammars without no need for these kind of iterations and generational transmission. And these languages can spread to the entire community. Okay. And this work on language evolution for me kind of set the basis to ask questions about language diversity. So why are there so many different languages in the world with so many different levels of grammatical complexity, right? So why do some languages become more systematic than others? And one thing that may cause languages to be different is the fact that they're spoken in different social environments. So languages evolve in different communities with different population sizes, different social structures, and different social needs. And the idea is that languages may adapt to fit these different social needs. So using the group communication paradigm I just showed you, I was able to experimentally tease apart different social features that could affect language diversity, namely community size and network structure, and to test how they shape the evolution of languages in the lab. So I'm only going to focus here on, well, I'm actually going to present that one later, but now focusing on community size. Here I asked, how does changing the size of the group affect the languages that would evolve in it? So does interacting with more people lead to a difference in languages structure? And to this end, I compared small groups of 4 people to larger groups of 8 people. And I want to reassure you that although these 2 groups sizes are super small compared to real world communities, right? So a big community in the real world is not 8 people, it's not even a small community. The idea is that everything in this experiment is scaled down, right? So there's not a lot of meetings. People have like 20 something things to talk about. They have 4 hours to do this. And then of course, in the real world, you've got thousands of things and a lifetime. So everything is scaled down. But importantly, by just doubling the amount of people in the group in this kind of mini setup, we already found that it makes a significant differences to the languages that would evolve. So basically what we found, and again, on the x-axis, I'm plotting time since the experiment started, and on the y-axis, the degree of systematicity. And I'm not going to go into any measures. If you're interested in how we actually measured this, I'm happy to answer this at the end. But eventually what you can see is that community size affected the grammatical structure of languages such that the big groups created more systematic languages at the end, and they did this faster and more consistently. So this is also the slope and also the kind of the error bar. And I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but the blue groups are kind of all over the place. Some have really high structure, some have really low structure. And the red groups, the big groups, are kind of all systematically and quite consistently doing the same thing. And the explanation for this trend was that the need to develop systematic languages was much higher in the larger groups. So imagine that, well, in the large group, you have less shared history with each person and you're exposed to a lot of variability. There's a lot of people. But in a small group, maybe with just 4 other people, we could just remember each other's unique variations. So I can remember that, that you say Buba for this item and you say Kiki for this item, and just remember it and never develop anything. But in a big group, that's really, really, really hard to do. You cannot just memorize the unique words used by every person in the group. You really have to try to kind of converge on something shared. So although convergence is harder in a big group, right, because it's harder to agree with 8 people than with 4 people, it's actually much more needed. And I'll get back to this point about convergence later on when I'm going to show you some more modeling work. Okay. So I think the important thing is that it means that members of larger groups are kind of under this stronger pressure to create languages that are more systematic and more generalizable, somehow more predictable, because that can ease communicative pressures, that can help you face the challenge and establish convergence if you learn something that's kind of easier. So I think these experimental findings to me were really interesting because they showed for the first time in an experimental setup that community size can really affect patterns of language diversity. So social and communicative pressures that are associated with just language use can shape the nature of languages that emerge in these different communities. Okay, but this conclusion also has really important consequences for language acquisition, because if languages with more regular and compositional grammar are easier to learn, as I assumed right now, and also is assumed by many other people, and if such languages tend to develop more in big communities, then this means that some languages are acquired faster than others, and that this learning advantage can be traced back to the size of the community and the degree of systematicity in the language. And this is a really big claim because it goes against, I would say, a pretty widespread axiom in the field of linguistics, or at least an old widespread axiom that states that all languages are, as hard to learn and as, take the same effort to acquire. We already, at least by children, and we already have kind of piling evidence that shows that this is really not the case. Learning trajectories and by children in different languages are different. We have, the classic case of Danish and the puzzle of Danish that shows that indeed some languages are just harder than others. But I think this suggests that they're harder for a reason, maybe because they're more or less structured or systematic. So to kind of test this idea, which I think is on one hand pretty intuitive, but actually was not very formally tested before, what I did was I took the languages that were created by the big and small groups in this experiment, the final languages, and I taught them to new people, 100 new people who were not a part of the original community, and saw if indeed it was the case that some languages were better learned than others. And these languages varied in the group size origin, so whether they came from a bigger and small group, and their degree of systematic structure ranging from very low structure to very high structure, and it was matched for all conditions. Okay, so the results showed that languages with more systematic grammars are indeed learned better. So if you can look here at the accuracy of learning, participants were more accurate at reproducing languages that were more structured and also learned them faster and more consistently. And I just, again, want to point out to this consistency thing, because I think it really matters. If you look at the very kind of far left side of the plot with the very low systematic languages, maybe you can see my cursor. I don't know if you can. You can. So these are the very low structured languages. These are basically language with no grammar. some people learn them really well, right? So some people are perfectly capable of learning these highly structured languages and unstructured languages, and some just really struggle. It's kind of hard. But if you look at the high structured languages, you see that everybody is at ceiling. Everybody learns these languages perfectly well. So these languages indeed kind of help you overcome these individual differences. Everybody's perfectly able to learn the grammar, but they struggle to different degrees when there isn't any. And this confirms this relationship between systematicity and learnability in a way that I find really interesting, but not interesting enough, because to me, that was just one part of the puzzle. And the second part of the puzzle was whether more structure helps you generalize better. So how well do people generalize the language they learn to new unfamiliar meanings that they've never seen before? So can learners apply the language they learn to new contexts, and will different learners do this in the same way? So for this, I gave participants another test. They saw 12 scenes with new combinations of shape and direction that they've never been trained on. They haven't seen them during training. And they were asked to label them according to what they thought would be correct based on the language they just learned. And participants could do anything they wanted in this test. So there was no right and wrong. They could make totally new words if they wanted, so not generalize at all. They can use homonyms, so replicate words that they already learned. They can combine words. They could use the rules of the language if there were any, basically do whatever they want. And then what I did is I looked at the generalizations of different participants and that learned the same language. And I asked, okay, how similar are these? Do different people generalize to new scenes in the same way and use the same words, despite never learning them and despite never interacting with each other? And the result was striking. It was indeed very clear. It showed that participants who learned more structured languages were much more likely to produce the exact same generalization, so much so that these 2 points are one. They're just identical. And these findings suggest that systematicity allows strangers to converge effortlessly. So people who never interacted before could potentially communicate successfully about new events and immediately be understood. And if you remember, this is exactly the mechanism I postulated that drives these group communication experiments I showed you. So having more structured language, the reason it's beneficial in the big group, because it facilitates convergence with more people and it kind of helps you overcome your challenge. And these results shows that I think the benefits of structure goes beyond learnability. It's not just that it's beneficial if you learn something new, it's also advantageous when you want to communicate with other people, and it aids your kind of productivity in general languages. Okay, so the next thing I did after this was to look at network structure. So does it have the same effect as community size? And here I asked, what happens when groups are of the same size, but they vary in how much and how community members are connected to each other? So is the process of language evolution also shaped by density or the sparsity of the group? So in the previous experiment I showed you, all groups were fully connected. Everybody spoke to everyone. But in the real world, this is really rarely the case, right? We are living in much bigger societies that are typically more sparse. Some people in our community would never meet. They would never interact. And still, you know, variations spread with everybody. So that's a really kind of a puzzle. And also not everybody's equally connected, right? Some people interact with many other people and others are a bit more isolated. So I wanted to look at these things. So I compared 3 different types of networks. The first network that I looked at was the fully connected network. It was just like before, where everybody speaks to everybody. And this resembles maybe very early human societies. It's quite rare nowadays, maybe some hunter-gatherer communities or some kind of remote villages. Maybe you can find this structure still. The next one I looked at is a small world network. Those are much sparser. They have much less connections. In fact, exactly half. So if you look at the lines, we actually removed half of the possible connections in the group. But it's much more realistic because strangers in these groups are still indirectly connected. So participant G and H, for example, they never interact, but they're nevertheless connected via participant F, for example, or D. So innovations can still spread. And the last network was a scale-free network. These networks have been argued to be the most representative of modern human societies, at least. So they're as sparse as the blue networks. They have exactly the same number of connections. But they follow a power law and how well agents are connected. So there are a few agents who are highly connected. In this case, if you look at participant A, he's the hub or the leader, as we want to call him. He's not actually the leader. He's just connected to almost everybody else in the group. But some agents are less connected. So for example, participant E and D are more isolated. They have interactions with less people. And here our prediction was that sparser networks, the blue and the green, would create more systematic languages for the same reasons as before. So because there's typically more variability and members have less shared history and it's harder to converge in these networks, it's also would therefore be much more needed, and there would be a greater pressure to create structure in these networks. But that's not what we found. So we found no significant differences between all the three network conditions. All of them showed the same degree of high structure throughout the experiment, and very similar behavioral patterns when we looked at all the other measures like stability and accuracy and convergence. And this result to me makes a bit sense because we also looked at the variability of each network, because that was kind of what drives the effect. And we found that the variability was similar across all conditions. So it was not the case that the sparser networks were more diversified. It was the same. So I have, some ideas on how this design can be improved, because it's still just a null result. And I would urge you not to draw any strong conclusions from this. It seems like network structure has no effect, at least when size is kept constant and relatively small, but there's a lot of things in the design that could be improved. We talk about them in the paper, and I'm happy to, if you have some ideas, I'm happy to talk about them later. Okay, but I think this was really weird at the beginning for me, because network structure in the real world should have an effect. There's real world evidence that network structure and sparsity alongside community size might work. And this is work from emerging sign languages. So there is basically a really unique case of a language evolution in modern times. That's the case of sign languages emerging in real communities. And this is a process that's been documented by researchers in the last, let's say, 30 to 40 years. And research on emerging sign languages shows that the social environment indeed does shape the structure of these languages. Specifically, there seems to be this difference between village sign languages that emerge in very small, tightly knit, homogeneous communities where people have very dense connections and interact closely and on a daily basis with everybody else in their village. There's another type of community that's called the deaf community sign language. Those are kind of larger and sparser and more heterogeneous communities that are spread sometimes across a country, or at least in the case of Nicaraguan Sign Language, it's a school of the deaf that basically brought a lot of deaf people from all over the country, and a language emerged there. But based on a comparison between a village sign language called the El Said Bedouin Sign Language and the Israeli Sign Language, which is a deaf community, it seems that languages that emerge in these small, dense populations show more variability across speakers, and they're less conventionalized. So there's many different signs for saying the same thing, while in contrast, these large communities are more uniform and also more systematic. And this is despite the fact that both languages are of the same age. So they evolved around the same time and also in the same country. And this result is super interesting because it actually goes, so this is what we find. This is kind of, I just plotted the kind of the relationship between convergence and size. You see that convergence is fast in big communities, convergence is fast in the big communities and slow in the small communities. But this is a super surprising result because it stands in very, very sharp contrast to results from multiple very famous computational modeling, like the naming game, for example, which show that convergence is faster in small populations. And this also makes sense, right? Because computational models show that the time to converge increases with population size. So given the same time, if you have, if you need to converge with 100 people, that's going to be harder than to converge with 5 people. So it makes a lot of sense that convergence is proportional to community size. And that's what these models show, but it's really not what we see in the real world. So what's going on? Why do these models don't fit the observations from emerging sign languages? Even so much so that they show the exact flipped result. It's really counterintuitive. But we had an idea about why this would be the case. And that's because, so my best hypothesis is that individuals' memory of other individuals plays a role here. So in the real world, when people interact, they remember who they talked to. They remember what did that specific person say. And this type of source memory is generally absent from models of language and norm emergence. but it's really important. So in these models, you kind of have two agents, you draw them from a population, they interact, they update, throw them back in the pool. And if at the next goal, you would take the exact two agents, they're not going to remember that they interacted with each other. They're just going to act as if this is a completely new interaction. But that's really not the way we humans behave, right? So I thought we need to implement this in the models. So this is joint work with Simon Kirby and Bill Thompson. And what we are trying to do is we resolve this by using a hierarchical structure in the model. So here there's populations of hierarchical Bayesian agents. They interact with each other using different variants. But they don't just infer the mean of the entire population. They also do this with respect to specific agents they already interacted with. So basically, they keep track of two things. They keep track of who said what or signed what. So build a model of individuals, and they have a model of the whole population. So the average of everybody they know. And they have a limited memory capacity. This is important. So they can't just store the data from everybody in the community. They can store, in this case, up to 100 individuals. This number is arbitrary. And when they interact with a known familiar agent, they can use the specific variants that they remember for that agent. But when they interact with someone new that they've never met before, then they will use this mean over the entire population. And when we run these simulations, this is very preliminary work. We're writing this up now and redoing the simulations. But what we find is indeed the pattern that mimics the pattern from emerging sign languages. So small populations converge slower. In fact, some of them never converge within the number of iterations in this model, maintaining the existence of a lot of different variants in the community because you can just remember them. But the big populations converge faster. They reduce the number of variants that coexist in the community by the end of the simulation. And even more interestingly, we can see what kind of convergence we get in this population. So I want you to I hope I can explain this plot well. It's a bit complicated, but it's really interesting. So take a look at this. This is a small population compared to a big population. And this is the start of the model. So here, each point represents a pair of individuals, the producer on the x-axis and the receiver on the y-axis. So every point is a possible pair in the community. And at the beginning, there is no convergence. All the pairs have different variants. They're spread everywhere for the big and the small groups. But over time, pairs could align. And if they align, they will be on this kind of diagonal axis. And this is what happens. But very importantly, when a point is aligned on the diagonal, it means that a pair is well coordinated. The receiver and producer have the same variance. But if the points are clustered on the diagonal, it means that all the pairs have the same convention. And what you see over time is that the small communities, they develop stable idiolects. They learn to remember and agree with each other, such that each pair has successful communication. But the variation across pairs is maintained. So you can see some pairs are here and some pairs are here. But in the large communities, you indeed see the formation of this kind of population-wide convention. Yeah, okay. So the next step I plan to take, Abdallah, how are we with time? Do we have a few more minutes?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna, as Abdallah mentioned, I'm starting my new group now, a language evolution and adaptation in diverse situations. And there's gonna be 3 major projects that we're gonna start to tackle. And I'm gonna present kind of the 3 of them because, well, clearly I'm very excited about them. But so the next step I plan to take is to link these experimental results to computational modeling. And the idea is to take the patterns that were obtained from the real groups of human participants during the group communication study I showed you before, and to compare them to patterns obtained from different size populations of interacting simulated agents. But in this case, the behavior of these agent-based models that I used in previous simulation is actually a bit too simple and too abstract compared to humans on this kind of micro scale. It's not good enough. So what we want to do is we want to examine this process in depth using deep learning methods. So this is done in collaboration with brilliant researchers at the Tel Aviv University and a postdoc who is being recruited as we speak. But the idea is that so it's very early stages of the project, and I'm just going to show you an idea. But the idea is to develop a close model of participants' behavior, which will allow us to test for the first time how community size affects the language of converging AIs. So I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. There's been a lot of work on deep learning agents communicating with each other and developing a shared language. That's not the goal. The goal is to try to use, to develop a model that's really closely anchored and grounded in an experimental procedure that people did. So basically having these networks do exactly the same as our participants, and then try to see what kind of constraints on the deep learning methods, the deep learning network you would need in order to get the same results, and whether we can kind of look in the box and see what is it that's happening. So these AIs are going to be composed of several levels. I don't know if I'm talking to people like who actually understand what I mean, but I will kind of try to communicate this anyway. So the idea is that there would be first a convolutional neural network that would translate a scene into, these moving shapes into an inner representation. And the idea is that these networks first need to learn how to see the world, right? They need to learn how to detect the visual input. People, we get this for free. They have eyes and you already can detect the shapes and the directions, but the networks need to learn this as well. And after that, there would be a feed-forward network that would compare two representations to see if they correspond to the same scene. So learning how to match, right? So is this scene the same as the other one? It's kind of a bit like the guessing part of the experiment I showed you. And then there would be a recurrent neural network encoder and decoder that would translate these inner representations into short text strings and then back. So basically learning how to speak and learning how to listen. So given an image, produce a text, and giving a text, match it to an image. And this actually brings us back to questions on language acquisition, right? Like, how do these artificial neural networks even learn to speak and listen? How fast will it take them to pick up on structure and regularities in their environment? I think this is very likely through the process of statistical learning and Bayesian inference, just like we've talked about in the very beginning. So tracking co-occurrences and updating probabilities of mappings giving experience. But once we have that established, we can examine the evolution of grammatical structure in these networks. So to this end, we plan to teach these networks how to successfully communicate with each other using supervised and then reinforcement learning. So the idea is we'd have different networks interact such that one network would get a scene and would produce a text for this scene. And then the other network would get this text, and that would have to match this scene to a right scene from an array of 8 possible scenes. Exactly the same type of interaction that we had with the human participants, and this is crucial. So once these networks communicate with each other over time, we can also examine their representations, their associated text, and see how they change as a function of interaction, and to see whether we get the same patterns of kind of emerging grammatical structure in these populations of AIs, and what do we need to constrain in order to get these. And of course, we can look at language diversity by manipulating the size of the AI population, having 4 agents versus 8 agents, really trying to replicate the experimental findings of big communities developing more structured languages. Okay, so that's one kind of big project. The other one, which also kind of tries to use computational modeling with the group communication paradigm, is the idea is we can investigate a lot of really exciting new topics on community structure. And in future work, and this I'm recruiting a PhD student for this, we plan to look at how age and gender diversity shape the process of language formation and innovation. And one of the most, I think this is a really interesting question, because there's one of the most intriguing findings in sociolinguistics is that speakers' gender and age can really affect the process of language change. So it was actually suggested that women are the leaders of language change. Some studies show that women are often linguistically more innovative than men, and they tend to adopt and accommodate new variants more frequently. And there's also similar studies that show that teenagers around the age of 17 also tend to create and to adopt new variants much more often than adults. And for the teenagers, I think we have this intuition a bit that, yeah, okay, teenagers, they innovate and they have their own language all the time. But the finding for women is a bit less clear. So what is it about women that makes them innovative? Is it their social role? Is it something about, our genitals? It's really, I mean, we don't know, right? And I think it's really important because these claims are based on very few case studies. They're based on, cases where people try to track language change when it already happened and try to kind of see where did it originate from. So for example, Be Like, I think this construction has been traced back to teenage girls, which is, it's really cool, but it doesn't, it's only correlational and kind of post hoc. So we never really tested this experimentally or computationally, so we don't really know how population differences in gender and age influence language evolution, language innovation, language change, and whether different linguistic tendencies are really associated with male and female speakers and adult and teen speakers in the lab. So the idea in this project is to couple experimental methods and computational modeling to determine whether women and adolescents really lead the process of language change from the initial stages of emergence. So here we will use the group communication paradigm and the simulated populations of hierarchical Bayesian agents and manipulate the composition of these mini societies in terms of the gender and age of individuals. So for example, we can test groups that are either homogeneously men, here in blue, men biased, gender balanced, so half and half, women biased, or homogeneously women, and the same for, either they're entirely teenagers, entirely adults, age balanced, and so on. And so will such changes in the identity of group members influence the creation and spread of norms over time? And is it really the case that women and teenagers are more likely to create and adopt novel words in this paradigm, as was suggested by previous theories? And here, the computational model that we're going to use is also going to be hierarchical, but we'll have an additional layer of memory depending on the social features of gender and age. So each agent is going to remember the variance of specific individuals, just like before, but they would also have a mean over a subpopulation. So for example, remembering what kind of variants are typically used by teenagers and which are typically used by adults. And of course, they would also have this representation of the entire population, a mean of means, if you want. So when you interact with someone new for the first time, these agents would choose the appropriate variants based on their estimation of the subpopulation that this new person is coming from. So you would use a typical adult variant if your agent that you're going to interact with is an adult, and different if it's a teenager. And we'll see what happens. Okay, last but not least, going back to language evolution, I'm currently in the process of adapting this group communication paradigm to virtual reality. This offers high ecological validity and a more naturalistic setup, but it also allows you to have high experimental control. And we already have the stimuli for this experiment. It's really cute. It's different novel creatures that vary based on their shape and their size, their movement type, so whether they kind of hop or walk, and their speed. And the goal of this adaptation is to test how modality differences affect the pressure of language evolution. And specifically, we're going to compare the process of language formation using gestures, vocalizations, or both. And looking at how gestural and vocal languages are formed in the VR environment, we can examine, I'd say, the multimodal origin of language, which has been, argued to be the case, and ask what kind of comparative advantages or disadvantages that each modality offer during the emergence of a novel communication system. So in this case, we predict that grammatical structure and iconicity will emerge in both modalities. You can imagine, for example, the size of the creature being expressed iconically in the signed modality by using a bigger gesture. That's pretty easy, but you can also imagine it being expressed iconically in speech using a high or a low vowel. So big things could have an ah in them, and little creatures can have an e in them. And I predict that this kind of, there might be more, very, very much anchored in previous work, more iconicity in the gestural modalities, because there's more affordances for gesture, for iconicity and gesture. And we're going to use this VR paradigm to achieve our final goal, which is to examine questions of language diversity, and specifically, how does language adapt to the physical environment, and specifically adverse or noisy conditions. So what happens if we add a physical disruption? Would adaptations occur? And in particularly, we plan to introduce wind to the VR environment by adding a sound on the speakers that masks the sound of an S. So it's going to be like a thing. And our prediction is that in these kind of windy environments, the vocal languages would include less S sounds, or even not at all, because these would be really hard to detect by others. And this would show that, and the environment can really affect the basic building blocks of language. What kind of sounds are used? And for the gesture environment, we plan to introduce poor lighting, a little bit of darkness. And in this case, we predict that the sign languages would have to adapt by making gestures larger and more salient. And these adaptations can really influence the interplay between iconicity and systematicity, because imagine that if large gestures can no longer be used iconically to indicate a larger creature, this might force participants to shift away from iconicity into something more arbitrary. Okay. That was a lot of information that I just gave you. But that's basically kind of a wrap up of my research so far, of linking these three things. And I hope you can see that they all kind of constantly feed back and affect each other. And my goal is to uncover this kind of time course of social dynamics and cognitive mechanisms that characterize us and language communication. And I'm really happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks.
Thank you, Limor, for this really great talk. It's very cool and refreshing to see these interesting connections between different aspects of language that appear to be completely independent, but it's very, also the fact that you're using different methods, computational modeling, experiments, PR. It's very fascinating. I'm gonna follow up closely your research. All right, so let's open the floor for questions. If you have a question, either you can raise your hand or just open the mic, because I can't see everyone. Yes, Ricardo.
Okay, thanks. This was really impressive. I had read some of the papers, but it's nice to get the big picture. I hope this is not a too annoying question, but so you're mostly working on a referential language level. But the way that we use language is also to coordinate and do all sort of other things. And I was wondering whether you had considered adding these more interactional dimensions of language, like repair or different tasks than just recognizing the same alien or figure that you have.
Yes. Oh, thank you for setting up the grounds for me to talk about the swarm robotics thing, because it's so basically that's the idea. So agent-based models are very limited because all they do, like the goal of the model is to communicate. And in the real world, of course, we communicate for a purpose. We want to achieve something together. There's a collaborative task or a joint action thing going on. And the agent-based models, I think, are pretty limited. And I mean, we can have additional layers of collaborative tasks, but it's a bit more artificial. And swarm robotics, which are basically little tiny simulations of insect robots, their goal, these are very popular models in cultural evolution simulations and simulations of joint behavior. It's basically many little models. And for example, they need to robots, and they need to build a bridge or collect food or build a nest. They're modeled after insects, so things like ant behavior, colonies, bees, and so on. And what we're trying to do now in collaboration, we also presented this at CES yesterday. We're trying to build, and it's also embodied. So these agents are in space. You can actually like have a video and see the agent, you know, they bump into objects and they bump into each other. And every time they're in proximity, they can interact. And when they leave, it's done. So using these more kind of embodied, environmentally anchored models to achieve a goal. So the first thing, this is a very long process because these models at the moment are so far away from agent-based models and how complicated the cognitive capacities of agents are. They're very simple. They don't keep track of any interaction. It's like a kind of it's a one-shot interaction thing. So they bump into an agent, and if the agent is standing still, they go over him, and if he's moving, stuff like this. It's not complicated enough. So what we're doing now is we're introducing memory and individuation into these swarm robots. And the end goal is to, well, eventually model something like self-domestication and language evolution in an environment where robots have a shared task. And this shared task can be very simple. It could be, for example, aggregation in a certain position. So go to your nest, form a nest. And it can also be collecting, foraging, so collecting resources and telling another robot where the resources can be found. So there's a lot of, these models are actually pretty rich in those kind of collaborative behaviors, but they're not rich in cognitive behaviors. And we have the agent-based models, which are very rich in cognition and very poor on joint collaboration. So we're kind of trying to bring these things a bit closer together. But I'm going to be pessimistic and say that I think it's going to take a long time before I can present a model of, you know, robots doing a joint task and developing a language. We're really far from there. And also, I know nothing about robotics, so I'm like I'm working with two really brilliant engineers who know nothing about language, so it's great. But yeah, so there's much work to do, but I think you're right on the money, Ricardo, because that's what these models are missing. They're missing some real connection, first of all, to the environment and moving and having this physical aspect, and second, in the fact that the goal is not to develop a language. That's never the goal. That's a side project, byproduct of the need to do stuff together. Then we happen to have a language, and in this case, all our models and experiments are kind of lacking in that sense. We do this by motivating people. We say, okay, your goal is to earn points, and you earn points when you successfully interact, and then you get a prize. So that's how we kind of introduce a collaborative task, but it's not real. It's yeah, good point.
Thanks.
Other questions? We started a little bit late, so we can take like 5 to 10 minutes for questions.
Also, if you want to ask something and you're not sure, you can write me an email. You can ask me on Twitter. And also, there are no stupid questions. I found that people often say, "I'm sorry if this is a stupid question," and then they ask like the most, the question that gets to exactly the core of where I fucked it up. So
I know exactly the people they're talking about. They're with us here.
Well, if nobody is jumping up, then I have a second question. That is, language is used in many ways also to signal social identity. And the way that we learn language as second or third or fourth language actually plays a huge role in the social interactions. So this was just if you had any thought on how to introduce these dimensions in the kind of language evolution games and simulations that you have been playing with.
Yeah, I think the closest we have of language as a social marker is the last model I showed with the age and gender thing. So having a hierarchical model that tracks or basically associates variant with a specific subpopulation. So people of a certain age or people of a certain gender, but clearly this architecture is very, it's abstract. You can use it to model socioeconomic status or your L2 or your height. It's really, you can do anything. You can parse the community based on any feature you find interesting. I think that's getting into the point. So there is really early work, like experimental work. I think it's either Sean Roberts or Garrett Roberts, never know. Garrett, where they did the divergence experiment. So they had basically people interact, and for what they were either in competition or in a collaborative dynamic. And I think I don't think it's an even like properly published thing. It's probably a conference proceeding that I'm thinking of. But in a way, yeah, when there was a competition between pairs, then there was never any there were never any convergence or any shared thing, and each group kept to its own. And when there was a collaborative context, then they kind of merged. And I think this speaks more to things like in-group and out-group bias, and what is it that we are trying to achieve with language if we're trying to differentiate ourselves from other people by using very unique words or unique variants, or not. And a lot of this is, of course, implicit, right? So we can come from a certain socioeconomic background and just use certain variants without knowing that we're using them. And there's quite some work about in-group bias and out-group bias in language, for example.
Switch, right?
Sorry?
Encode switch that
also, yeah.
Background, when you're speaking with a professor, you change your accent to be treated in a different way.
Right. And a lot of this accommodation, we don't even notice that we do it, right? So we can, the way I speak in a courtroom and the way I speak in a market is really different, and I don't even notice that, I kind of change the variants or use a different word or even use a different pronunciation. And I think the first step, so I would say this is not the line of work that I've been engaged with, but a similar, I would say along these lines, this idea of trying to look whether teenagers and adults and women and men use different variants in the lab again, I don't think they'll notice it. I think this is going to be a very implicit, if we find a difference. I highly doubt that people will be like, oh yeah, I decided to use this variant, and the guy will be like, I decided to use this variant. It's probably going to be very mild tendencies unbeknown to our participants. You can only track with kind of observing this in many groups. But I've never really looked at like language as a social marker. I'm always kind of assuming in these paradigms, at least, that the goal is to collaborate. The goal is not to differentiate. It's not to be competitive, is to understand each other. But you're absolutely right that in the real world, we have, we're not just interacting with 8 people with a goal of total mutual understanding. We can interact with 800 people, and some of them we don't want to bond with.
Or we don't want to be seen perfectly interacting with, right?
Right. So one thing in the swarm robotics model that we have is there's individuation and there's a prosociality measure. So robots they will be more likely to interact with an agent they have previously successfully interacted with. And if their first interaction was unsuccessful, they're going to kind of have low prosociality, and the next time they meet might ignore each other. So there is, and that the reason we added this prosociality measure is because our goal is to look at self-domestication. And there the idea is that self-domestication involves reduced and reactive aggression over time, and that it's facilitating language evolution. So, but again, that could maybe tap into that a little bit, but again, it's really far. At this moment, it's only a proof of concept to show that that when you have this kind of pro-social measures and an individuation, that you get basically different sub-lexical groups. So what we found was that when all the agents are as likely to interact with all the other agents, you get global convergence across 3 nests of swarm robots. But when you have a proximity prosociality thing where robots are more likely to interact with robots they previously interacted with successfully, you basically get 3 subpopulations depending on the networks, the nests. So here you get one variant and here you get another variant. So it's a bit like dialectology based on space. So maybe that's kinda. That's
pretty interesting. And yeah, we can talk about that at another stage, so we don't just.
I can also send at the end the link to that talk. That's the talk given by Roman, my collaborator, because I do not feel comfortable presenting swarm robotics stuff, but and also it's mostly his work. But I'm happy to share both the links to the elephant as well. I saw another hand.
Yeah, I saw a couple of hands and then they disappeared. Like, what happened?
I'm scary.
Come on, Chiara, if you want to. No. Huge fan. I love your work. I was wondering to what extent, like smaller community, or would be less used to adapt somehow, and maybe meeting less people trigger the being less used to interact and to adapt to people. Maybe they converge less up to at some points they stop being able to do it because they need
like conformism somehow.
And I was wondering to what extent you can like weigh up and down that feature
right.
And I have another question, if I may. Like linguistic change is also, as far as I know, triggered by political and like invasions and wars, and sorry for the bad stuff, but and I was wondering to what extent you can, for historical dominance of some language relatively to others, can be implemented in your work, because it seems to me that it's a feature that definitely play a role about that.
Yeah, so I'll actually start with your first question, with your second question, because I think it's a bit easier. Yeah, my work doesn't tap to the historical change at all. We are trying to do everything by isolating and kind of, one feature at a time. So how does community size affect this? And then we have the experiment where the only thing that differs is community size. You can do this with network structure, you can do this with age. How do you model one variant of like conflict or war is really hard to do in the lab. I'm sure you can think of maybe one single kind of manipulation that you could do in different conditions. Maybe something like, I don't know, priming people with aggression, an aggressive task or something before, but I'm not sure we need it, because those changes in the sense of historical records are pretty straightforward. So there have been, hundreds of years of, phylogenic work on language change and language trees, that we have a clear understanding on why different variants of like why languages split, and how does these variants enter French or English or so on based on contact. We know those things. I think what we don't know is what are the mechanisms behind these things, and for that we need the lab experiments and the computational modeling. So actually they come to explain real world patterns that we see and have observed, and now we want to say, okay, why did we observe them? And I think for the case of, for example, war or occupation, it's pretty clear that if you have a language, so I can imagine even you have a small group of 4 people, they develop a language, you embed them in a group of 12 people with a different language. At some point they'll just have to converge, unless there's very strong motivation for them to keep their language. They're going to have to adapt to the other people. So you can maybe think of experiments like that. But you would have to isolate one feature at a time if you want to have clear explanations. And I think, yeah,
reform my restate my intuition, at least. It's just that it seems to me that there is a tension when a language in contact to another is dominant for a long time, for instance, for several generations, and then you can expect this language to dominate, and then the structure to be more imitated and shared and adapted. But you could also expect that since it's well established, they do not need to be adapted a lot, like since it's imposed to others. I don't know. So yeah.
I mean, it depends on how you set up the experiment. If you set strong motivation or strong incentives for collaboration and adaptation, you'll get it. If people can understand each other without it, then you might not. I had an experiment that I never did because my PhD was done and I didn't have any more time. It was a bit of a L2 thing. So basically having people form a language, learn a language really well, and then embed them in another group where people speak another language and see what happens. And a lot of the manipulation there, I thought it would matter how we introduce these people. So if we introduce these people as, somehow they come with their own like really super prestigious language, then maybe the other people might end up adapting to them, or some merge like a kind of almost a Creole thing happening. But if you introduce them as like, oh, these people, they invented something, it's not really good, and now they're in your group, I think people are less likely to accommodate. So really accommodation is depending on social norms and social perception, and we tend to accommodate to people we perceive, as more prestigious. So it really, I never got to do this experiment though. So still cool if someone wants to do it. The setup is ready, you just need to do it. But I want to answer your first question, because I think that is so you basically asked, does exposure to more variability in a way kind of already, the way I interpret this question is whether it already leads you to be more, accommodative and generalizing because you're experiencing a lot of variability already. And maybe if you come from a super conformist world where you'd never seen different things, then you're also less likely to generalize. And that is a huge study in psychological and social sciences, which is, you're exactly right to say this is the case. People, for example, that are exposed to, intuitive example, even better. If you've never in your life seen a wedding dress that's not white, if you've only seen white wedding dresses because you come from a Christian background, then when you see a wedding dress that's red and green and has gold in it, you'll be like, this is weird, this doesn't look, you might not be able to call it a wedding dress. But if you were raised in a very multicultural environment where you were exposed to people from different cultures, you might be very well, able to say, yes, this is clearly a wedding dress, even if it's not white. And we have a lot of studies with facial perception and sexual norms and, how do you say, tolerance to different opinions and different and pornography and like a lot of homosexuality, that shows that when you're exposed to very diverse background with a lot of different people, you're much more likely to accommodate and tolerate new things, even if those are not the things you've seen before. So that's, I mean, but it's so basically variability is kind of the stuff generalizations are made of. If you don't have a wide array of variants, you're not likely to generalize them. Actually, priming, we're writing a paper about this now. It's a TICS review, and it's about the fact that this kind of thing that you just mentioned has been basically discovered, rediscovered in all possible fields of human behavior, motor learning, categorization, language, social norms. Everybody always keeps finding that if you practice your, tennis in a serve in a more diverse situation, using different racks, using different environments, using whatever, you will be better at, generalizing your serve to a new thing. And the same with categories and whatever. But those fields never talk, and even though they reach the exact same conclusion, there is no like theoretically unified model of why variability does this. Why does lack of variability make us conformist? And this is also true for language. So we're trying to write this paper. We're not offering the model because it's too complicated, but we're just saying like, hey, look at this. All these different fields do exactly the same thing and call it in different names, but you don't, but it's also actually the same thing. So we're revising this now. So if you're interested, I can also share very much work in progress.
All right, so maybe we can have one last question.
Oh yeah, 120.
Kara, did you have something? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much. It was super interesting. I have maybe two questions. Like one is in relation to your first study in your master. Yeah, so I know you said it, but this might be a silly question. So you said that so the statistical learning, let's say, skill, I don't know how to say. Yeah, so it doesn't change for the auditory stimuli, at least when there are language-like stimuli, right? Yeah. But it changed for visual stimuli. And I was wondering then, for the case of sign language, so where the visual are clearly language stimuli, like maybe there is some I don't know, like if you...
That is not a stupid question. That is a brilliant follow-up study, because what you need to do, what you would need to do to answer your question is to have the exact same study done with deaf, either with signers, so it would be hard to do the auditory condition, but maybe just with signers. So hearing participants who have a lot of experience with visual gestural languages, and if that, or I can even imagine something like, comic artists or people who, on a daily basis have this kind of visual language input. And if that's the case, sequential input, and if that's the case, I would expect their results to look in their visual learning to look the same as the auditory learning because of their increased experience. Yeah. That's not a stupid question. That's like
well, okay. And then the other maybe is more of a comment, baby. I have no idea about all this computational stuff, so sorry. But and also I don't know anything about social linguistics. But the little I know, like once I attended to some lectures from Penelope Eckert, and so for example, she was amazing. Get me interested even if I didn't know. So she described all this thing of like how. Yeah, maybe somebody had already commented about how some choice to use some variants are to define your identity, and how different groups are more or less prone to actually change. And so the cool ones, like the underground people, they like to change, but the other one, they will be always there. And I have no idea but if it's possible to manipulate, because also I know a little thing I attended, it was actually about like formal social linguistics. So like, yeah, and so for example, there were some studies on Obama, how it changes his way of speaking depending on the setting. And like, so for example, you would use the variant, I don't know, I cannot even do it in English, like the ing without the G at the end, if he was at a barbecue, to be more friendly. But then, and so now I know that they did these models of like if you want to sound friendly, you do these things. If you, and I have no idea if there is some way to integrate these two things in your super fancy for me models. Like no.
Maybe not in the model, but I think your question is getting at the question of like of why do teenagers actually then differ? Is it something about the social pressures, something about what it is that when you're a teenager, what it is that you're hoping to achieve or to be when or what's your social role in the society? Do you really want to kind of be right with your own little group of friends, but maybe you really don't want, you know, the boring adults to understand you? So this, I mean, the trying to be more friendly, it also depends with whom, right? What's your goal? So in a way, this is, I think you're, again, not silly at all, because it taps into why would adults and teenagers be different. You can say that, okay, teenagers are in this like super weird stage in life, so it's not about their age, it's not anything in their brain or in their, not even maybe their hormones, it's something about the social niche that they're in as teenagers, that they have very specific social goals with their peers, but not with, you know, their extended group. And maybe adults, that you're kind of expanding who you want to be right by. And I think this is really also forms a puzzle to the woman findings, because why would women then be the leaders of language change? Or what is, it's definitely, my intuition is this has nothing to do with our biology, that it's really about the social stereotypes that are associated with women being agreeable, being accommodating, and maybe in a community that's less gender unequal and more balanced, and, you know, the social norms that are, you know, distributed between men and women, you might find that women are not the leaders of language change because they behave just as men in these social settings. So I think it will be really interesting to try to see, and this is, I mean, I'm leaving, this is a PhD project, so a lot of it, I mean, I have the ideas, but I'm going to hope that the PhD that we end up hiring is going to also come up with really interesting ideas into how do you tease these apart? How do you tease, you know, when you bring people in the lab, they're women in a specific society, how do you strip the social norms from these games? So maybe you need a community of all women, but having some women be like assigning them more conformative roles, or priming them somehow with a, I don't know, more, as I said, more aggressive, what my answer to Axel, more aggressive behavior or something, and then see if their linguistic behavior changes based on kind of how they enter the task. I really don't think it's about our biology. I really don't think there is something fundamental about women that would do this, but maybe there is, and that would also be interesting to find out.
And now, so maybe it's a clarification, like when you say, so women are like leaders in change, but then you make the link to the fact that they are more agreeable, like they tend to be more agreeable. But so maybe I didn't understand. So like,
no, it's
leader in change
point.
is like to like be innovative, so you want to change somehow, and right?
So there's two factors. There are two factors of being a leader, and also in language change, they make this differentiation between the innovator and the early adapter. So early adopter. So women are, I mean, also the early adopters, which means that they're, so if someone produces a variant and no one adopts it, it's really the first people that accommodate.
Loser.
Right. But if no one, if you pick up, if you're an early adopter, you have a really important role in spreading these variations. But also it shows that women are, these studies, and again, very few, some of them suggest that women are also more linguistically innovative, so they would be more likely to introduce a new variant. But I am also prepared for this whole project to fail miserably, because it's based on so little data and observations, many of them by Penelope, that, you know, but they're already tracking language change as it happens. Sadly, in the real world, we can't track language change from the very infancy, from the very first stage, because we don't know that it's going to be interesting, right? So only when it's already reached this threshold that, you know, enough people are starting to use this new variant, then we can try to see, okay, where does it come from? And we always do this by, for example, looking at it's more like a correlational thing, taking, okay, in 1996, testing adults and teenagers and seeing what's the proportion of how much they use the variants, and then testing them 10 years later and seeing that, you know, more of the adults now use it. In the past, it was mostly the teenagers, and now it's everybody, or something like this. So, but it's very indirect, and maybe in the lab we'll find nothing. We'll find that no, it's not the case, that there is more, and everybody in the lab is the same, because they're stripped of their social roles and they're stripped of their social niche. And it's very much possible. My intuition is that we will have to be very smart in how we model these groups. What is it about? So I would expect something like a first experiment with men and women or teenagers or whatever, that shows no difference. And then we say, okay, it's because the most important part that brings women to be innovative, or teenagers to be innovative, was gone in our setting. Let's try to make our setting more like a real life, and introduce pressures like the ones Ricardo was saying. So who do I want to interact with? So maybe give an incentive for, you know, some people to speak to other people more than others, and or something like this. But they've got 4 years to figure it out.
Yeah, but anyway, like, just a thought now that you played it, it was like, maybe women like are innovative because, I mean, at least with language we can do whatever we want. With many other things we cannot.
Right. And of course, you know, one way to look at this, and I wish I could do this, is to run these experiments in different societies, right? So run this experiment in a society that's more gender imbalanced. I mean, even our society is really not perfect, but I'm, you know, happy to say that at least, you know, we're not, it's been worse. And maybe we need to go to a society that's kind of less progressive and see, but then you run into all these other problems of how do you run artificial language experiments with people who are not familiar, are not weird, you know, they're not familiar with the setup, they're not familiar with our computers, they're not familiar. It's just like, why are we doing it? It's really, really hard. But yeah, very much of interest. I think in that sense, that kind of ideal experiment would solve the problem a bit. So if you could take this experiment and do it in a, you know, gender balanced community and a gender imbalanced community, and show that in one community you get to, here you don't get this difference, and here you do get this difference, and it's really about social role. And a lot of the studies that showed women are the innovators of language change come from the 70s.
Yeah.
You might say, okay, maybe it's also, you know, they had less exposure. So men would go to work and would leave the house and would have to interact all formally with all their other peers, and would be much like more conformist, and would risk, if they would do something different, it would be risky. And women, they were, you know, chatting with their peers and could do whatever they want and didn't have the social pressure, but also not the social variability. So maybe a little variant within your group of friends spreads really quickly because you don't have that many friends. There's so many things that have changed already since the 70s that it's really,
it's time to see what's going on. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Limor, for the great talk and for your time. It's been really a pleasure talking to you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, and if you have more questions, like for other people, maybe you can get in touch directly with Limor on our Twitter or email.
And what I could do, Abdallah, is I could send you, or in the mailing list, the links to the elephant talk and
yeah,
the Swarm
sure.
Robots
Of course.
talk,
Yeah.
then I'll just send it in the.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. All right, and last thing, since Ricardo is here, I'm just gonna announce, like I'm gonna send out the announcement this afternoon, but he's gonna speak to us next week about language acquisition, children with autism. So please don't miss his talk. It's gonna be wonderful.
You said the talks are recorded, right? Is there a way I can see Ricardo's talk, because I can't actually attend it next week?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll send you the video.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you all.
Bye bye. Thanks, everyone.